I've ridden through 100 valleys. Annie said, her voice low and unsteady, and not one of them stopped me cold. Not one. She looked at him across the fence line, the flowers wild and impossible behind him in the dry New Mexico dust. Why would a man like you plant something this beautiful in a place this hard? Ira. Sutton looked back at her without flinching, without hurry. The way a man looks at something he's been waiting to see for a long time, without knowing he was waiting. Same reason anyone plants anything, he said quietly. Because you believe something good can grow where nobody else thought to try. She didn't ride on for a very long time. If this story is already pulling at your heart, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to the channel, follow every part of Annie and Ira's story to the very end, and drop a comment telling me the name of your city. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Annie Hawthorne had been riding for 6 hours when she finally let herself believe she was close. The letter from her cousin Margaret had said Cimarron Valley was roughly 40 miles east of the rail stop at Cordell, and that the road, if you could call it a road, would take you through 2 dry creek beds, past a bleached cattle skull nailed to a fence post, and then down into a wide amber basin where the land spread out like a table someone had set for a feast that never came. Margaret had been dramatic in her descriptions always, but this time she hadn't been wrong. Annie had passed the skull. She had crossed the creek beds. She had come down into the basin and watched the valley open itself up around her flat. Wind scraped the color of old straw under the April sky. It was beautiful in the way that hard places sometimes are. Not soft, not welcoming, but honest. She was 29 years old, and she had ridden alone out of Santa Fe with a single-packed saddlebag, a ledger book wrapped in oilcloth, and the absolute determination not to be afraid of anything she couldn't see yet. She'd been keeping books for businesses since she was 19. She'd kept them for a general store in Albuquerque, a telegraph office in Taos, and most recently for a sheep operation outside Las Cruces that had folded when the owner drank himself into bad contracts. She was good at the work. She was better at it than most men who claimed the same skill, and she'd stopped apologizing for knowing that about herself sometime around her 26th birthday. The position at Hrick's Freighting in Cimarron had come to her through Margaret's husband, who hauled cargo for the company and had a good word to put in. The pay was fair. The town was small. And Annie needed to be somewhere new badly enough that she had packed her bag the same evening she'd received the offer and not looked back once. She crested the low ridge north of the valley road, and that was when she saw it. She stopped her horse without meaning to. Her hands went still on the reins. For a moment she forgot she was tired. The ranch below was not the largest she'd passed. The house was plain, the barn solid, the corrals well kept, but nothing remarkable. What stopped her was what grew along the eastern slope between the barn and the far fence line. A field of wildflowers, dense and deliberate, spilling color across the dry ground in every direction. Yellows and purples and deep burnt orange mixed with white, and the particular vivid blue she associated with mountain elevations, not valley floors. They were blooming hard in the April light, as if someone had argued with the landscape and won. She sat there staring for a moment longer than she should have. Then she rode down. She hadn't made a decision about it exactly. She'd just pointed her horse toward the fence line and let it move. Later she would tell Margaret it was curiosity. That was true as far as it went. She was still 20 yards out when she heard him. "You think a man like me plants flowers just to look at them?" Howe was standing near the fence post at the near corner of the field, a short-handled spade resting against his hip, watching her with the kind of patience that didn't come from having nothing better to do. It came from being comfortable in silence, which was a different thing entirely. He was broad across the shoulders, with dark hair starting to silver at the temples, maybe 40 or close to it, with the kind of face that weather had worked on for a long time without breaking. His eyes were steady, and a shade of gray-green she couldn't quite name. Annie rested her forearm on the saddle horn and looked at him. "I wasn't sure what to think," she said. "I'm still not." "Fair enough." He drove the spade an inch into the earth beside him, not looking away from her. "You're coming into the valley, or going out?" "Coming in. I'm taking a position at Hrick's Freighting." Something in his expression shifted just slightly, not surprise, more like interest settling in. "Bookkeeper." "That's right. Ned Hicks mentioned he was expecting someone. He nodded once slowly, as if filing that information somewhere. Ira Sutton. This is my land. Annie Hawthorne. She glanced at the field again because she couldn't help it. You still haven't answered your own question. He almost smiled. She could see it in the way the corner of his mouth didn't quite commit. No, he said. I suppose I haven't. She waited. My mother planted the first row, he said after a moment. 20 years ago when she came out here with my father and decided the land was too lonely to look at every day without something to answer it back. She died 12 years ago. I kept planting. He said it simply without asking for anything in return. So I guess the honest answer is, I plant them because she started them, and because some things are worth continuing whether or not they make practical sense. Annie looked at him for a long moment. That's a good answer, she said. It's the only one I've got. She rode on toward Cimarron, but she thought about that field for the rest of the day, and that night in the small room above Margaret's house that smelled of pine soap and wool. She thought about it again before she slept. Ned Hicks was a compact, serious man in his mid-50s who shook Annie's hand exactly once, sat her down in front of his ledgers, and didn't say anything for 2 minutes while he let her look through the books herself. When she looked up, he was watching her with the kind of expression men wore when they were trying not to look impressed. Well, he said, your accounts receivable column is 3 months behind. You've got a freight advance from March that hasn't been reconciled, and whoever was handling your payroll was rounding up on wage entries in a way that doesn't quite add up. She kept her voice even. Not dramatically, but consistently. Ned Hicks was quiet. I'm not saying it was intentional, Annie said, but you should know it's there. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, you can start tomorrow. I'd like to start today if that's all right with you. He pushed the ledger across the desk toward her. I'll have someone bring you a chair. It took her the rest of that first day, and most of the second, to work through the backlog, cross-reference the freight invoices, and build a clear picture of what Hicks Freighting actually owned against what it was owed. On the third morning, she laid out a summary on a single page, set it on Ned's desk, and waited while he read it. This is right, he asked. Check it yourself if you want. I'd encourage it. He read it again. Then he said without looking up, Margaret Briggs said you were good. I didn't expect you to be this fast. Being fast is part of being good, Annie said. You lose money every week the books aren't current. He looked at her then, and this time he didn't try to hide that he was impressed. What do you need to keep them current? Access to the freight manifests the same day they're completed. A direct line to whoever handles incoming contracts, not a summary 2 days later. And if anyone in this office makes a payment or receives one, I need to know about it before the end of that business day. Ned Hicks sat back. He was the kind of man who ran things by making decisions quickly and then holding to them. She could see it in the way he didn't deliberate. Done, he said. All 3. By the end of her first week, the other 2 men in the office, a freight dispatcher named Cole and a young clerk named Billy, who was 17 and perpetually ink-stained, had stopped looking sideways at her when she asked questions and started answering them straight. That was progress enough for a first week. She settled in. She found a rhythm. And on the following Sunday, almost without planning to, she rode back out to the North Road. She told herself she was exploring the valley roads. That wasn't entirely a lie. But she took the northern route, and she slowed when she came to the ridge above Ira Sutton's ranch, and she rode down to the fence line along the flower field without pretending any more that it was accidental. Howe was there again. This time, he was working along the far end of the field with a long-handled cultivator, and he looked up when he heard her horse, and he raised one hand in acknowledgement before going back to the work. He didn't stop. He didn't walk over immediately. He let her come to him, which she appreciated more than she would have said out loud. She dismounted at the fence. He finished the row he was working and walked over, pulling a handkerchief from his back pocket and wiping his hands. Bookkeeper, he said. Rancher, she said back. He smiled at that one. It was a real smile, not the half-concealed, almost smile from before, and it changed his face entirely, made him younger, made him easier. "How's Ned treating you?" he asked. "Well, he's a fair man." "Hi is. Toughest fair man in the valley, probably." Ira leaned against the fence post. "You settling into town all right?" "I'm staying with Margaret Briggs until I find something of my own. The room is comfortable." She looked out at the field. "How far does it run?" "About a quarter-mile along the slope, maybe 60 yards wide at the broadest point. Took me 4 years to get it to this size." He followed her gaze. "Come May it'll be thicker. Some of the varieties don't hit their peak until late spring." "How do you keep them from being overgrown by the grass?" "Careful." He said it without irony, just as a plain statement of method. "You have to keep coming back to it. You can't do it all at once and leave it." She looked at him then, and something in the way he'd said it made the words mean more than the flowers. "That's true of most things worth keeping," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Yes, it is." They stood at that fence for another 40 minutes, talking about the valley, the water rights along the creek, the behavior of the soil in dry years, which ranchers were reliable neighbors, and which ones had a tendency to let their cattle drift across boundary lines and then act surprised about it. He was specific and unhurried in his opinions. He didn't perform certainty where he didn't have it, which she found immediately refreshing. Most men she'd dealt with in business and out had a habit of filling uncertainty with volume. Ira Sutton seemed to regard silence as a perfectly legitimate response when silence was appropriate. When she finally remounted and said she should get back before dark, he nodded once and said simply, "Same time next week if you want to see how the east end of the field is coming in." It wasn't an invitation that required anything from her. It was just an open door. "I'll think about it," she said. She was back the following Sunday before noon. The weeks moved with the particular quality that April weeks have in high desert country. Long days with cool mornings and evenings that smelled of sage and cedar smoke. Annie moved through her work at Hrick's Freighting with the focused precision that had always been her strongest quality and the one she trusted most, and she moved through the rest of her life in Cimarron with the careful observant patience of someone learning a new place and not wanting to rush the learning. She joined the community in the ways that mattered, attending church without broadcasting her attendance, helping Margaret's neighbor Mrs. Garfield carry supplies when the older woman's back was troubling her, making herself easy and useful without making herself conspicuous. She learned who the town banker was and whether he could be trusted with a straight question. She learned which of the freight company's regular clients paid on time and which ones had a talent for creative explanation about why they couldn't. She learned that the hardware store owner was the real center of Cimarron's social information network, far more than the saloon, and she learned this by spending 20 minutes buying nails one afternoon and listening. At Ira's ranch, she learned other things. She learned that he had run the operation alone since his father's death 7 years prior, with seasonal help for branding and harvest, but no permanent hands. She learned he kept 30 head of cattle, a small horse operation he was quietly proud of, and a kitchen garden behind the house that his father had planted, and that Ira maintained with the same dedicated attention he gave the flower field. She learned he had a sister in Colorado, whom he wrote to monthly, and a brother he hadn't spoken to in 11 years over a land dispute that had started badly and ended worse. He told her about the brother without rancor, just as a fact of the landscape, like the dry creek bed or the hard winters. "Do you think you'll ever settle it?" she asked one afternoon. He was repairing a section while she sat on the top rail, having discovered early on that he worked while he talked, and that this was simply how he functioned. She'd adapted. She liked it, actually. The conversation threaded through the physical work, nothing too precious, nothing performed. "I don't know," he said. "Martin made some choices that hurt people I cared about. I'm not sure forgiveness is mine to give. Some of it belongs to them, not me." He drove a nail cleanly. "But I don't carry it around like a stone, if that's what you're asking. It's just unfinished." "Most true things are," she said. He glanced up at her with that look he sometimes had measured, curious, as if she'd said something that landed differently than she knew. He did this occasionally, took one of her offhand observations and turned it over quietly in his mind, and she'd found she was starting to look forward to the moment she saw it happen. "Where'd you come from before Santa Fe?" he asked. "Las Cruces. Before that, Taos. Before that, a town outside Albuquerque that I won't trouble you with." She watched a hawk trace a slow circle overhead. "I follow the work. That's one way to do it. It's the honest way. I'm good at this particular work, and I go where it's needed, and I've seen a good portion of the territory doing it." She paused. "I used to think that was a disadvantage, moving so often. And now I think it taught me to read a place quickly, and a person even quicker. You stop wasting time on first impressions that are just nerves, and you start looking for what's actually there." He was quiet for a moment, working the next nail into position. "What did you see here?" he asked. "First impression. Honestly?" She looked out toward the flower field. "I saw something that had no practical reason to be there, and that someone had clearly poured a great deal of care into anyway." She glanced back at him. "I thought that was worth a second look." Ira drove the nail in a single clean strike. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I thought pretty much the same thing." She felt the words land quietly in the center of her chest and didn't answer right away. The hawk made one more circle above them and then was gone. It was mid-May when the trouble announced itself. The way trouble in Cimarron Valley had a habit of doing, not loudly, not dramatically, but in small specific facts that added up wrong if you were paying the right kind of attention. Annie was paying the right kind of attention. The Hicks freight accounts ran on a simple principle. Goods moved from the rail depot at Cordell into the valley and to smaller outposts beyond, and the billing followed the manifest. Freight weight, distance, condition on delivery, and the name of the contract holder. Clean. Straightforward. The kind of operation that should be easy to keep honest. But there was a freight contractor named Devin Cass who had been operating in the valley for 8 years, running a side contract with Hicks that handled specialty cargo tools, medicine, some legal documents, bonded shipments that required a specific signature chain. Annie had noticed Cass's invoices in the first week because they were always slightly off from the manifests, not dramatically, but consistently in the same direction. The delivered weights were logged 0.5% lighter than the receipt weights at Cordell. In a single shipment, it meant nothing. Across 8 years of specialty cargo, it meant a deliberate patient theft that had never been audited closely enough to catch. She didn't say anything about it immediately. She gathered. She compared. She cross-referenced Cass's signature receipts against the depot records that were kept on file at Hicks, a parallel set of numbers that had apparently never been compared side by side. By the 3rd week of May, she had 4 months of evidence laid out in a single clear column, and the column told a story that was impossible to read as anything but deliberate. She went to Ned Hicks on a Thursday morning and closed the office door behind her. He looked at the column. He didn't say anything for a long time. "How long?" he asked finally. "The oldest records I can access go back 6 years. It's consistent through all of them." She kept her voice level. "I can't tell you how it started or whether anyone helped him, but I can tell you it's been continuous and systematic." Ned's jaw was tight. "Cass has been with this company since before I took over the operation." "I know. He's got a wife and 2 boys." "I know that too." She let the silence hold for a moment. "I'm not telling you what to do with the information, Ned. That's not my job. My job was to find it and show it to you. What happens next is yours." He looked at her. He looked at the column again. "Is there any chance you made an error? Check it yourself. I'd encourage it, same as I said the first week." She paused. "I didn't make an error." He knew she hadn't. She could see it in his face, the particular expression of a man who has just been handed a problem he can't unsee. He sat back in his chair, and he looked older than he had 5 minutes before. "I'll need to talk to the county sheriff," he said, "and probably a lawyer." "I'd recommend doing it in that order," Annie said. "And I'd recommend doing it soon. Cass has a shipment scheduled for the end of next week. If you wait past that, you'll have a harder case to make about what happened to the excess on this one." Ned nodded once slowly. He looked up at her with something that wasn't quite gratitude yet, but was heading in that direction. "This is going to make some people in this valley very uncomfortable, Annie." "I imagine so. Some of them are going to wonder how a woman who's been here 6 weeks managed to find what no one else found in 6 years." She met his eyes steadily. "Let them wonder." She told Ira about it the following Sunday, sitting on the fence rail while he turned the soil along the south edge of the flower field. She told him the way she told him most things plainly with the relevant details, and none of the ones that didn't serve the telling. He worked while he listened. He always did. But she had learned to read him well enough now to know when something was landing with weight. There was a particular quality to his silence when he was thinking hard, rather than just waiting. "Cass has a temper," he said when she'd finished. "I got that impression. He's not a dangerous man, I think. But a man who feels cornered and isn't used to being told no can get loud and ugly fast." He set down the cultivator and looked at her directly. "Are you being careful?" The question was simple and sincere, and without any condescension in it. He wasn't asking because he doubted her. He was asking because he was paying attention to what was real. "I'm being careful," she said. "Ned knows what's in those books. If anything changes in those books before the sheriff gets involved, the changed version will tell its own story." "Good." He picked up the cultivator again. "You're not worried?" She considered the honest answer. "I'm aware," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her again with that particular expression, taking her in, turning something over. "Yes, there is," he said. They worked the field together for the next hour, her pulling the small ground cover weeds along the path between the rows while he worked the soil. They talked about other things. The price of feed. The horse he was expecting from a breeder in Colorado in June, a gray quarter-horse mare he'd been corresponding about for months. The way the late spring evenings in the valley had a quality of light that he'd never been able to fully explain, but that he'd never found anywhere else either. "Did you ever think about leaving?" Annie asked. "After your father died, when it was just you?" He thought about it honestly, which she'd come to expect. "Once," he said. "The first winter alone was hard in ways I hadn't prepared for. Not the work, I knew the work, but the quiet." He turned the soil deliberately. "There's a kind of quiet that's restful, and there's a kind that starts to sound like something is wrong with the world. That first winter had more of the second kind." "What changed it?" "Spring," he said simply. "The field came back, and I realized I'd been the one tending it through all of that, and it had been tending me back without my noticing." He paused. "I haven't thought about leaving since." Annie looked at the field, the colors dense and moving slightly in the afternoon wind, the vivid blues still shocking against the dry valley walls in the distance. "I think I understand that," she said. She wasn't talking entirely about flowers, and she thought he knew that. He kept his eyes on but the line of his shoulders changed slightly. The way a man's shoulders change when he's heard something he wasn't expecting, and is deciding quietly what to do with it. He didn't say anything right away. He finished the row, turned at the end, started back. Then, without looking up, he said, "You're welcome here, Annie, whenever you want to come." Not as a question. Not as a proposition. Just as a fact, he was stating the same way he stated all the things he meant. She pulled a weed from between two flower stems and set it aside. "I know," she said quietly. "Thank you for saying it out loud." The valley light turned gold around them, and neither of them said anything more for a while, and it was the most comfortable silence Annie Hawthorne had sat in for as long as she could remember. The sheriff came to Cimarron on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday afternoon, everyone in the valley knew why. That was the thing about small places: information didn't travel, it detonated. Annie had understood this from the first week, had factored it into every decision she made about timing and sequence, and still watching it happen was something different than anticipating it. By the time she walked to the Hicks office Thursday morning, 3 people had stopped her on the street with questions disguised as concern, and one of them, a woman named Dora Pelham, who ran the dry goods counter and had a talent for the particular cruelty of appearing sympathetic, had said, with her head tilted just slightly to one side, "I heard you're the one who brought all this trouble down on Devin Cass. That must be a difficult thing to carry." Annie had looked at her for exactly 1 second. "I found a theft," she said. "The difficulty belongs to the man who committed it." And she had walked on without slowing. But Dora Pelham was not the real problem. The real problem was waiting for her at the office. Devin Cass was standing in the outer room when Annie arrived, hat in hand, and the first thing she registered was that he was working very hard to look calm. He was a broad man, maybe 45, with a weathered face, and the kind of hands that had spent decades on freight lines. He wasn't violent in his posture. She read people carefully, and this man was not going to lunge at her, but there was something in his eyes that was worse than anger. It was the look of a man who had decided that if he could just get the right words out, the whole situation could still be walked back. "Miss Hawthorne," he said. His voice was steady. "I was hoping we could talk." Behind him, she could see Billy at his desk, staring at his ink pot with the intense concentration of a young man who desperately did not want to be part of whatever was happening. Annie set her satchel on her desk. "Ned's in," she said to Billy. "In his office, ma'am." She looked at Cass. "Then this conversation happens in front of Ned, or it doesn't happen." Something moved through his expression. Frustration, calculation, the rapid internal adjustment of a man revising his approach. "That's fine," he said. "That's completely fine." It was not fine. She knew that from the way he said it. Ned was already standing when they came in, which told her he'd heard Cass arrive and had been waiting. He gestured to the two chairs across from his desk. Annie took one. Cass took the other. Ned remained standing, which was a choice, and a deliberate one. "Devon," Ned said. Not warmly. Not coldly either. Just a name stated as a point of departure. "I want to explain the numbers," Cass said. He'd dropped the careful calm somewhat now that they were in the room. There was something rawer in his voice. "There are explanations for the numbers, Ned. This woman came in here 6 weeks ago and pulled records out of context and built a case that doesn't account for. The weight discrepancies go back 6 years, Annie said. Her voice was even. They follow your signature chain exclusively, and the variance is never in the other direction." She let that sit for a moment. "If there's an explanation, I'd like to hear it. I genuinely would." Cass turned to look at her. He was trying to keep something contained in his face. "You don't know this valley," he said. "You don't know how things work out here. There's a flexibility to how freight gets logged when you're moving in rough conditions." "Show me the rough condition adjustments in the depot records," Annie said simply. "If the variance is a legitimate field correction, it'll appear on both ends of the ledger." Cass went quiet. The silence lasted about 3 seconds, which was long enough. "It won't appear there," Annie said. "Because it isn't there. You know that, and I know that. And now Ned knows it in a room with a witness." Cass turned back to Ned. Whatever strategy he'd walked in with had just collapsed, and he was improvising now, which made him more unpredictable. "Ned, 22 years. I've been running freight for this company for 22 years. You're going to let one woman with a ledger book walk in here and end that?" Ned looked at him for a long moment. "Devon," he said, and this time the name had weight in it. "If the numbers are wrong, tell me why they're wrong. I'm listening. I've been listening for 3 days waiting for an answer that made sense." He paused. "I haven't gotten one yet." Cass stood up. Not aggressively, but with the particular restless energy of a man who had run out of room to maneuver sitting down. He put his hat back on. He looked at Annie with an expression she catalogued carefully, not threatening, but pointed. Pointed the way a finger is pointed before a word is said. "You made an enemy today," he said. Quietly, evenly. "I want you to know that." "You made yours 6 years ago," Annie said. "When you decided to take what wasn't yours." He left. The door didn't slam, which somehow was worse than if it had. Ned sat down heavily in his chair. He pressed his fingers to his forehead for a moment, then dropped his hand and looked at her. "How are you?" "I'm fine," she said. "I meant what I said to him. The difficulty is his. He's not a man who takes loss quietly. I know." She picked up her satchel from where she'd set it by the door. "I'm going to keep doing my work, Ned. That's the best answer I have to men like Devon Cass." She went to her desk and opened the ledger, and the morning moved on. But she was aware carefully, constantly aware in a way she hadn't been the week before. She told Ira about it on Sunday. Not immediately. They'd been talking about the gray mare he was expecting from Colorado, which had been delayed by a lame leg, that the breeder swore was a temporary stone bruise, and that Ira was reserving judgment on, and she let that conversation run its natural course, because she'd learned that the natural course of a conversation with Ira Sutton usually arrived somewhere worth arriving. "Cass came to see me," he said when she'd finished. He was sitting on the fence rail this time, which was a reversal of their usual arrangement, and she was standing with her shoulder against the post. Monday evening. He wanted to know how well I knew you. Annie went still. What did you tell him? I told him well enough. He looked at her steadily. He wanted to know if I thought you were the kind of woman who could be talked out of a position once she'd taken it. What did you tell him? I told him I hadn't seen any evidence of that. A pause. He didn't seem pleased with the answer. What else did he say? Ira looked at the field for a moment. He said you were new here and didn't understand how things worked, and that people who came in from outside and tried to change things too fast had a habit of finding the valley less welcoming than it looked. He said it plainly without dramatizing it, because that was how he operated. He told you what was real and let you weigh it yourself. Annie felt something cold move through her, quiet and precise. Not fear exactly. Assessment. He's trying to find out how isolated I am, she said. That's what I thought too. And what do you think about that? Ira turned to look at her directly. I think he's going to find out he miscalculated, he said. And I think you should know that if you need anything at all, you don't have to ask twice. It was not a grand declaration. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, without flourish, without asking for acknowledgement. Just a fact placed on the table between them, where she could pick it up or leave it. She held his gaze. Thank you, Ira. Don't thank me. Just tell me if something changes. I will, she said. And she meant it the way she meant serious things, fully, without reservation. They stayed at the fence until the afternoon light shifted, and when she finally rode back to Cimarron, she carried the conversation with her the whole way, turning it over in her mind, not with worry, but with something that felt like the specific weight of knowing you were not alone. That mattered more than she'd expected it to. The following 2 weeks moved fast and tight. The sheriff, a careful, deliberate man named Howard Pratt, who had been working the county for 15 years, and who Annie assessed as honest and thorough, within the first 10 minutes of speaking with him, came back to Cimarron with a territorial marshal in the second week of June. They spent 2 days at the Hrick's office, reviewing the records Annie had prepared. She answered every question they asked directly, and without elaboration, gave them what they needed and did not speculate about what she couldn't document. On the third day, Devin Cass was formally charged. The valley reacted, the way small valleys react when someone long established is revealed to have been something other than what he appeared. There was shock, and there was anger, and there was the uncomfortable third thing that always follows those two, which is the quiet retrospective arithmetic people do when they realize they'd been living next to a deception and hadn't seen it. Some of that arithmetic landed on Cass. Some of it inevitably landed on Annie, not as blame exactly, but as the particular discomfort people feel toward whoever forced them to see something they'd preferred not to see. Margaret warned her about it on a Wednesday evening over supper. There are people saying you were too aggressive, Margaret said carefully, that you could have handled it more quietly, brought it to Ned privately, and let him manage it without the law. The law was always going to be involved, Annie said. The only question was whether it happened before or after more money disappeared. She cut a piece of bread and considered for a moment. Who's saying it? Dora Pelham mostly, a few of the others who run in her circle. Of course. Annie set down the bread. Margaret, when a man steals for 6 years from under people's noses, and the person who finds it is a woman who's been here 6 weeks, some people are going to be more comfortable with the woman as the problem. I expected that. It doesn't change what the numbers say. Margaret looked at her steadily. You're not upset. I'm clear-eyed, Annie said. That's different from not upset. She picked up the bread again. I'm going to be at that office for as long as Ned will have me. I'm going to do my work correctly and let the work answer what the gossip can't. Margaret reached across and put her hand briefly over Annie's. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The next Sunday brought a sky that had been building storms since Thursday, and Annie rode out to Ira's ranch with the wind already pulling at her coat and the particular charged quality in the air that comes before serious weather. She knew she should probably have stayed in town. She went anyway. He heard her coming and met her at the gate, and the first thing he said was, "You should have stayed in town." "Probably," she said, I took her horse's reins without comment and led the animal into the barn, and she followed because there was nowhere else logical to go. Inside, the storm sounds were muffled, and the smell of hay and horses and old wood replaced the electric edge of the outside air. He settled her horse into a stall with the ease of long habit, and she leaned against the wall and watched him work. "I heard Cass was formally charged," he said, not looking up. Thursday. Marshal Pratt filed the papers. "Good." He checked the water in the stall trough. "How's the valley treating you after, depending on who you ask?" He glanced over. "I'm asking." "Ned's solid. Cole and Billy are solid. About half the valley has decided I did the right thing, and the other half has decided I did it the wrong way." She paused. "The half that decided I did it the wrong way mostly means they would have preferred I'd done it quietly enough that they didn't have to know about it at all." Ira made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was close to one, dry and without bitterness. "That's Cimarron," he said. "That's most places, actually." "I know." She looked at her hands for a moment. "It doesn't trouble me the way it might have when I was younger, but I'd be lying if I said it felt good." He came and stood near her, not close enough to crowd, just near enough to be present. "You did the right thing," he said. "I know I did. Knowing it and feeling it aren't always the same thing at the same time." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that direct, unhurried attention that she had come to think of as one of his defining qualities. The willingness to really look without calculating what looking cost him. "No," she said quietly. "They're not." Outside, the storm broke properly, rain hard against the barn roof, the sound of it filling the space around them. Neither of them moved. They stood in the dry warmth of the barn, with the horse shifting softly in the stall and the storm loud on the roof, and the conversation moved on to other things. The flower field which he'd staked against the wind 2 days ago, on the instinct that weather was coming. The Colorado mare who was finally scheduled to arrive in 3 weeks. The kitchen garden that was producing more than he could use alone, and that he'd been quietly distributing to the widow Garfield and 2 other households on the North Road. "You do that regularly?" Annie asked. "The distributing?" "When there's more than I need." He said it without ceremony. "My mother used to say, a garden that feeds only one person is only doing half its job." Annie thought about that. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was practical," he said, "in the best sense of the word. She believed things had purposes, and that you honored the purpose by letting it be what it was supposed to be." He was quiet for a moment. "She would have liked you." The statement landed softly without pressure. He wasn't asking anything with it. He was just saying a true thing. "I hope so," Annie said. The rain went on for 2 hours. They talked through most of it, not continuously, but in the easy rhythm of people who have gotten comfortable enough with each other that silence doesn't need filling, and that makes the talking, when it comes, feel like a choice rather than an obligation. He told her about the year the creek had flooded badly enough to take out 3 fence lines and half the east pasture, and how he and his father had spent a week in mud up to their knees rebuilding what they could. She told him about the winter she'd spent in Taos, living on credit, while a contract fell through, and working 3 jobs simultaneously to keep the numbers in her favor, and about how that winter had given her a kind of confidence she hadn't had before. Not arrogance, but the bone-level knowledge that she could manage hard things and come out the other side, still herself. "That's the important part," he said. "Coming out still yourself." "A lot of people don't," she said. "No." He looked at the barn wall for a moment. "A lot of people come out as the hard thing that happened to them, instead of the person who survived it." She looked at him carefully. There was something personal in that she could hear it without him stating it. She didn't push. She simply let it be there between them, because she'd learned that was the right way to hold the things he offered. Lightly, with room for him to take them back if he needed to. He didn't take it back. He let it sit. When the rain softened to a steady drizzle, she said she should ride back while she still had light. He walked her horse out and held the bridle while she mounted, and then he looked up at her with the particular steadiness she'd come to know as his version of saying something important. "You're doing well here, Annie," he said. "I want you to know I think that, whatever anyone else says." She settled in the saddle and gathered the reins. "Coming from you," she said, That means something. She could see that it landed the slight shift in his expression, the quality of his stillness in that moment. He was a man who didn't expect to be told his words had weight, which meant he probably hadn't heard it said often enough. "Ride careful," he said. "Always," she said. She turned her horse toward the road, and rode back into the drizzle, and the barn, and the ranch, and the dormant flower field disappeared behind her in the gray evening, and she carried the warmth of the afternoon with her, all the way back to town. What she didn't see as she crested the ridge north of the valley road was the figure on horseback stopped in the shadow of the tree line above Ira's gate, still watching her go. She didn't see it. But if she had, she would have recognized the build, the hat, the particular set of shoulders of a man who felt he had something to settle and had not yet decided how. Devin Cass watched her ride away, and then he turned his horse and went back the way he had come into the dark between the trees without making a sound. She found out about Cass watching her on a Wednesday, and it didn't come from Ira. It came from Billy. The boy had been jumpy all morning, dropping his pen twice, answering questions, half a beat too slow, and Annie had let it go until mid-afternoon when she looked up from the freight manifest she was reconciling and said without prelude, "Whatever it is, just say it." Billy looked at the door to make sure Ned wasn't in earshot. Then he turned back to her and said in a voice pitched low and careful, "Tom Reedy told me he saw Devin Cass up on the North Ridge last Sunday evening, on horseback, watching the road." He stopped. "The road you ride when you come back from the Sutton place." Annie set her pen down. "How long was he there?" she asked. Tom didn't know. He only saw him for a minute before Cass moved off into the trees. But Tom said he was just watching, not moving, just watching the road. She kept her face level, because Billy was already wound tight enough, and adding alarm to the room would help nothing. "Did Tom tell the sheriff?" "He told me first. I don't think he wanted to make trouble if it was nothing." "It isn't nothing," Annie said. "Tell Tom to go to Pratt today, not tomorrow, today." She picked up her pen again. "Thank you for telling me, Billy. You did the right thing." He nodded quickly, relieved to have it out of his hands, and went back to his desk. Annie returned to the manifest, but she wasn't reading it. She was thinking. Cass had been charged. His case was moving toward a territorial court hearing. A man in that position, watching the woman whose records had put him there, that wasn't curiosity. That was a man keeping track of what he considered an enemy, measuring distance, calculating. She'd read Cass right in Ned's office, not violent by nature, but capable of becoming something worse than violent when he felt he had nothing left to lose. The question was whether he'd reached that point yet. She rode to Ira's that evening instead of waiting for Sunday. It was the first time she'd come on a weekday, and she registered the change in his expression when he came out and saw her. Not surprise, but a sharpening of attention. The look of a man who immediately understood that something had shifted. She told him about Cass on the ridge, all of it including Billy's account and what she thought it meant. Ira listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment that had a specific texture to it, not hesitation, but the kind of stillness that precedes a decision that's already been made. "I should have told you Monday," he said. "I heard a rumor from Pete Garza at the feed store that Cass had been riding the north roads at odd hours. I didn't have anything solid enough to bring you." Annie looked at him. "Ira, I know." He met her eyes. "I was trying not to alarm you without cause. That was wrong. You needed the information, and I should have given it to you and let you decide what to do with it." She appreciated that he said it plainly without excuse. "Yes," she said. "You should have. It won't happen again." She believed him. Not because he said it, but because of the way he said it, with the particular gravity of a man making an accounting of himself, not just managing a moment. She filed it and moved on. "Pratt needs to know about the Ridge sighting," she said. "I'll ride to town with you and we'll go together." She shook her head. "I can go to Pratt myself. I don't need an escort." "I know you don't." He said it without concession, just a straight acknowledgement. "I want to go because Pratt will take it more seriously if I'm there to corroborate the pattern. He trusts my read on people." A pause. "Is that a reason you'll accept?" It was a good reason. It was a true reason. And he'd offered it as a reason, rather than as an argument, which was the difference between asking and pressing. "Yes," she said. That's a reason I'll accept. They rode to town together as the evening light went amber and long across the valley, and they went to Pratt's office and laid out the full account between them. The Ridge sighting, the odd hours riding the confrontation in Ned's office, and what Cass had said on his way out. Pratt listened with his hands flat on his desk and his expression giving nothing away until they'd finished. "I'll put a deputy on the North Road in the evenings," he said, "and I'll go have a direct conversation with Cass about what riding near Miss Hawthorne's route constitutes under the terms of his current legal status." He looked at Annie. "I want you to come to me immediately if anything changes. Anything at all. Don't filter it for whether it seems significant. Let me make that call." "Understood," Annie said. Pratt looked at Ira. Something passed between the two men, the specific communication of people who have known each other a long time and can say a thing completely without words. Ira nodded once. They rode back toward the north end of the valley in the near dark, and for a long stretch neither of them spoke. The quiet between them was different from their usual comfortable silence, not tense exactly, but weighted in a way that meant something was working itself toward the surface. It was Ira who said it. "I don't want you riding the North Road alone after dark," he said. "I know that's not mine to say. I know you can handle yourself, but I'd rather say it and have you tell me to mind my business than not say it and find out it mattered." Annie rode for a moment without answering. She was thinking about what it meant that he'd said it the way he had, leading with the acknowledgement that he had no standing to direct her offering the concern anyway, because the concern was real and making it possible for her to refuse without it becoming a confrontation. There was a kind of emotional intelligence in that approach that she'd noticed in him before, but that still surprised her when it appeared. "I won't ride after dark alone on the North Road," she said. "Not because you said so, because it's sensible." "That's all I needed to know," he said. She glanced at him sideways in the low light. "You know," she said, "most men would have phrased that as an instruction." "Most men would have been wrong too," he said. They parted at the junction where the North Road met the main valley track, she toward Cimarron, he back toward the ranch, and she rode the last mile to Margaret's house, thinking about that exchange, turning it over, not analytically, but with a warmth she'd stopped pretending wasn't there. The July heat arrived hard and fast that year. The way desert heat does, not gradually but all at once, as if the temperature had made a decision. Annie worked through it at the Hrick's office with the window open and a steady supply of the cold well water that Billy, who had appointed himself her unofficial ally, brought to her desk without being asked. The freight business accelerated in summer. More shipments, more contracts, more manifest errors to catch and correct. She was doing the work of 1.5 people and doing it well, and Ned had noticed. He called her into his office on the second Thursday of July and offered her a raise without her having to ask for it, which she appreciated. Not for the money, though the money was welcome, but for what the offer meant about how he saw her position in the company. "I want to expand the bookkeeping function," he said. "Start bringing the freight manifest reconciliation in-house, rather than relying on the depot copies coming to us 3 days late. That means more work and more responsibility." He looked at her directly. "I want that work to be yours." "I'll need direct access to the depot agent at Cordell," she said. "A standing arrangement, not case by case." "I can arrange that, and I'll need Cole to loop me in on contract negotiations before they close, not after. The back-end numbers only make sense if I know what was promised on the front end." Ned almost smiled. "Cole's not going to love that." "Cole will manage," she said. "He's a practical man." He was. Cole grumbled for exactly 1 week and then adapted because Annie's system made his job easier in ways he hadn't anticipated, and practical men, when presented with evidence that something works, adjust. The work expanded and deepened, and she moved through it with the focused, quiet authority of a woman who had found the place where her abilities fit exactly and who understood the particular satisfaction of that fit. She was happy in the work. She hadn't let herself register that word clearly until now. Happy, but sitting at her desk in the Hrick's office on a July afternoon with the freight manifests in order and the accounts current, and Billy bringing her water and Ned trusting her judgment, she acknowledged it plainly. She was happy, and every Sunday she rode to Ira's ranch. The flower field was in its fullest summer expression, now dense and vivid and slightly overwhelming in the best way. the kind of sight that made you stop moving for a moment because your eyes needed time to take it in. Annie had stopping. She'd been coming long enough now that the field felt familiar, which was its own kind of intimacy. You stopped being astonished by something and started being at home with it, and those were different relationships entirely. She and Ira worked the field together most Sundays, not because the work required two people, but because they'd fallen into the habit, and the habit had become the point. She'd learned which varieties he'd cultivated deliberately, and which had come in on the wind and been allowed to stay. She'd learned how to read the condition of the soil by what grew at the margins. She'd learned mostly by watching him and asking the occasional question, the particular patience that perennial plants require, the understanding that you are not building something for now, but for years from now, and that the work you do today will be seen most clearly by a version of yourself that doesn't yet exist. She'd been thinking about that in other terms without quite saying it out loud. It was Ira who said something first. One Sunday in mid-July, not about the flowers, but about something adjacent to them. They were sitting at the table in his kitchen after working the field drinking coffee that he made strong and without apology, and the conversation had moved through several subjects in the easy, unhurried way. Their conversations usually moved the gray mare, who had finally arrived and was everything he'd hoped for. The upcoming community meeting about the creek water rights dispute that had been simmering for 2 years. Margaret's news that she was expecting again, which Annie had shared with uncomplicated pleasure. And then Ira said without particular preamble, "My sister Helen is coming in August." Annie looked up. "To visit." "She comes every 2 years or so, stays 3 weeks usually." He turned his coffee cup once in his hands, a small, thoughtful motion she'd noticed he made when he was choosing words carefully. "I'd like her to meet you." The simplicity of it was what landed. Not, "I wonder if you'd like to meet her." Not, "I thought perhaps you two might get on." Just a plain statement of wanting offered without drama or demand. He'd like his sister to meet her. That was all. And they both understood that it wasn't all, and that the not all of it was significant, and that he was letting it be significant by saying it this simply. Annie held her coffee cup and looked at him. "I'd like that," she said. He nodded once satisfied and drank his coffee, and the conversation moved on. But something in the room had changed, and they both knew it, and neither of them felt any need to name it in the moment. Some things were better understood than declared. It was 4 days later that the first real trouble came. Annie was at the Hrick's office early on a Friday morning, earlier than usual, because she'd had a feeling about a set of numbers in the Cordell Depot records that she wanted to run down before the day got busy. She was the only one in the office when the door opened. She expected Billy. It wasn't Billy. It was a man she didn't recognize, maybe 35, lean with a careful, deliberate way of moving that told her immediately he hadn't come in by accident. He closed the door behind him and looked around the office before his eyes settled on her, which was a way of assessing the room that she associated with men who operated in margins. "Miss Hawthorne," he said. "That's right. My name is Roy Lander." He came to the edge of her desk without being invited to and stopped there. "I represent certain interests connected to Devon Cass's freight operation. Previous freight operation." The correction was smooth practiced. "I understand you've been very thorough in your review of the Hrick's accounts." "I've done my job," she said. "Of course." He smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "The thing is, Miss Hawthorne, thoroughness sometimes turns up things that are complicated. Things that may not be entirely what they appear at first glance." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope which he placed on her desk. "This is an offer, a straightforward one, for a formal signed statement from you indicating that certain of the discrepancies in the Cass accounts could be attributed to recording error rather than intentional misappropriation." Annie looked at the envelope. She didn't touch it. "You're asking me to provide a false statement," she said. "I'm asking you to consider whether your initial interpretation might have been premature." "It wasn't premature," she said. "It was accurate. 6 years of documented evidence is not a misreading." Lander's expression didn't change. "The amount in that envelope would allow a woman in your position to make certain choices she might not otherwise be able to make. Relocation. Stability." A deliberate pause. Fresh start somewhere new, away from the complications that come with being the person who brought a well-liked man down in a close community. Annie looked at him steadily. "Take the envelope," she said. "Take it and leave this office and don't come back." "Miss Hawthorne, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to decide whether you'd like to walk out of here before I call for Sheriff Pratt," she said. Her voice was completely even. "Because what you just described to me is witness tampering, and the sheriff's office is 2 streets over, and Billy Marsh will be here in about 5 minutes, which means you have a narrow window." She held his gaze. "I'd use it." Something shifted in Lander's expression. Not fear, but the cold recalculation of a man revising his assessment of his odds. He picked up the envelope. He put it back in his coat. He looked at her for one more moment with the expression of a man making a note of something, and then he left. Annie waited until the door closed. Then she exhaled one long, controlled breath and stood up because she was not going to let her hands shake sitting down when there was something she could do instead. She went to the door, opened it, looked up the street toward Pratt's office and started walking. She told Pratt everything in under 5 minutes. He had the same expression he'd had before, hands flat on the desk, face giving nothing. But she could see something change in his eyes when she described Lander's offer. "Roy Lander," he said. "I know that name." He was already reaching for his hat. "He's done work for a land attorney out of Albuquerque who has a history of this kind of approach." He stood up. "You did exactly right coming straight to me." "I know," she said. He looked at her with something that was very close to respect. "Miss Hawthorne, do you understand what this means? If Lander is involved, Cass isn't operating alone. There's someone with more resources and more to lose backing this freight scheme." She had already thought of this on the walk over. "The bonded specialty cargo," she said. "The shipments that needed a signature chain. I assumed Cass was falsifying the weights to skim value. But if there's an attorney involved, a land attorney specifically, those specialty shipments might have been carrying something else entirely. Documents maybe. Filed as standard cargo." Pratt stared at her. "You worked that out in 5 minutes. I worked it out in 2, she said. "But I wanted to be sure before I said it." He put his hat on. "Come with me back to Hrick's. I need to look at those specialty cargo manifests again, and I need you to walk me through them." She did. They spent 3 hours going through the bonded shipment records she'd already pulled and cataloged, and the picture that emerged was worse than simple freight theft. Mixed in among the legitimate bonded cargo medicine legal documents, surveying equipment. There were 18 specialty shipments over 4 years, with documentation that, under close examination, described land survey records for parcels in Cimarron Valley that had never been formally filed with the Territorial Land Office. Surveys that, if filed, would affect title claims on 3 separate ranches. One of those ranches was Ira's. Annie set the manifest down very carefully on Ned's desk. "Someone has been staging fraudulent land surveys through the Hrick's freight system," she said, "and using Cass to move the documentation without it going through official channels. If those surveys had been filed—" She stopped because the shape of it was becoming clear, and she needed a moment for the clarity to settle completely. If those surveys had been filed, Ira Sutton would have had a title dispute on his eastern parcels, the ones with the flower field. Pratt was very still. "Who benefits from a title dispute on that land?" Ned asked from the corner where he'd been listening. "Anyone who wanted to acquire it at distressed prices," Annie said. "When a man is fighting a legal challenge on his title, he can't sell at full value. He can't borrow against it. And if the challenge drags long enough—" She looked at the manifest again. "He sometimes has to let it go." Ned sat down. "Ira doesn't know any of this." "No," Annie said. "He doesn't." She rode to his ranch that afternoon. Not at the usual Sunday hour, not by the usual arrangement. She rode fast and direct, and when she came through the gate and found him at the corral with the gray mare, she dismounted before the horse had fully stopped and walked straight to him. He read her face immediately. "What happened?" she told him. "All of it. Lander, the bribery attempt. Pratt's identification of the land attorney connection. The specialty cargo manifests, the fraudulent surveys." She told him about his eastern parcels and what the surveys would have meant if they'd been filed. Ira listened with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. This was the stillness of a man absorbing something that had just changed the shape of his world. When she finished, he was almost to himself. Yes. He looked at her. His expression was not anger, or not only anger. It was something deeper and more complicated than that. You found this. The numbers found it, she said. I just read them. Annie. He said her name in a way he hadn't said it before, direct and full of weight without the careful distance he usually maintained. Those fields? He stopped. He looked at the eastern slope for a moment, at the flower field running vivid and dense along the hillside, and something moved through his face that she recognized as grief, in the way that grief sometimes looks like anger before it settles into what it actually is. My mother planted the first row. I've put 20 years into that ground. I know, she said softly. If those surveys had gone through, they didn't. She took one step toward him, not reaching, not pressing, just closing the distance slightly so her voice could be quieter and still reach him. They didn't go through because Cass got greedy with the freight weights, and I found the discrepancy and pulled on that thread. The surveys are still in that manifest and they've never been filed. Pratt has them now. She held his gaze. It's over, Ira. The threat to your land is over. I was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Open, almost unguarded in a way that told her the news had knocked something loose that he usually kept carefully in place. He was a contained man by nature. This was him without containment for just this moment. Why did you come today? He asked. You could have waited until Sunday. Because you needed to know, she said simply. And because, she paused, finding the honest words. Because when I found your name on that manifest, something in me went very still and very certain at the same time. And I thought he needs to hear this from me. Not from Pratt, not from Ned, from me. He held her gaze for a long, unguarded moment. The mare moved softly in the corral behind him. The flower field ran bright along the slope above. Thank you, he said. The two words carried everything, all the weight of what she'd done, and what it meant, and what he understood, without any of it needing to be elaborated. She nodded once. You're welcome. They stood in the late afternoon light, not speaking, not needing to, with the full knowledge of what had almost been lost, standing between them like a third thing, and the full understanding of what had been saved. Pratt arrested Roy Lander on a Saturday morning, and by Saturday afternoon, the land attorney in Albuquerque had sent a telegram to the territorial marshal's office that read in Annie's estimation, exactly like the communication of a man who had just realized his exposure was larger than he'd planned for, and was attempting to reframe his involvement before someone else framed it for him. She read the telegram because Pratt showed it to her, which told her something about how Pratt now regarded her role in all of this, not as a witness to be managed, but as someone whose read on the situation he trusted. He's going to claim he was Cass's legal representative and had no knowledge of the survey scheme, Pratt said. He knew, Annie said. The documentation chain on those specialty shipments required an attorney's verification signature at origination. His signature is on 4 of the 18 manifests. She handed the telegram back. He's hoping the territorial court won't look closely enough at the origination records. Will they? Not unless someone walks them through it the way I walked you through it. She looked at him evenly. I'm available to do that. Pratt studied her for a moment. You understand what that means. You'd be testifying against a land attorney with connections in Albuquerque. That's a different category of enemy than Devin Cass. I'm aware of the difference, she said. The answer is still yes. He nodded slowly. I'll be in touch. She walked back to the Hicks office in the clear August morning and sat at her desk and did her work because the work was still there and the work was still hers, and she had long ago learned that the most stabilizing thing in an unstable situation was to keep doing the thing you did well. The freight manifests didn't care about land attorneys or territorial courts. They required accuracy, and she gave them accuracy, and that was enough for this particular morning. Helen Sutton arrived on the Thursday stage from Cordell. Annie knew she was coming because Ira had mentioned it twice in the preceding 2 weeks, once casually and once with a specific quality of attention that told her the visit mattered to him more than the casual mention implied. She knew Helen was 43, 2 years older than Ira, and that she'd married a rancher in Colorado named Frank Aldridge, and had 3 children, and ran the household accounts for 2 neighboring properties in addition to her own. She knew these things because Ira had told her not all at once but in pieces over several Sundays, in the gradual way he shared things that were important to him. She met Helen on the Saturday of that week at Ira's ranch, and she was not prepared for how immediately Helen Sutton assessed her. It wasn't unfriendly. It was the directness of a woman who had learned, probably young, that the fastest way to know whether you could trust a person was to look at them straight and see what looked back. Helen had Ira's gray-green eyes and a quicker smile, and she shook Annie's hand the way men shook hands firmly, once no performance in it. "Ira wrote to me about you," Helen said. Annie glanced at Ira, who was making absolutely no apology for this with his expression. "He mentioned you were coming," Annie said. "He mentioned considerably more than that." Helen looked at her with open appraisal. "He said you were the most practically intelligent person he'd met in 20 years in this valley, and that you'd saved his land without knowing that was what you were doing, and that he thought about you constantly and didn't know what to do about it yet." A pause. "He didn't write all that in one letter. It accumulated." Annie felt the warmth climb into her face despite her best effort. She looked at Ira again. He had the expression of a man who had known this was going to happen and had decided it was worth it. "She was going to find out," he said by way of explanation. "I was going to find out," Helen agreed pleasantly. Annie laughed. It came out fully and without restraint, which surprised her, and Helen's expression shifted from assessing to warm so quickly it was like watching a door open. "All right," Helen said. "I think we're going to get along fine." They did. Helen was the kind of woman whose intelligence expressed itself in the same way Annie's did, practically specifically without flourish, and they recognized each other immediately in the way that competent women sometimes do when they're placed in the same room and given enough time. They talked while Ira worked the corral with the gray mare, and Helen asked questions that were neither polite nor prying, but genuinely curious, and Annie answered them with the same directness she'd give to anyone she'd already decided to respect. "How long have you known you were in love with my brother?" Helen asked at some point in the middle of the afternoon, with the same tone she might use to ask about freight rates. Annie looked at her for one beat. "I haven't said that." "No," Helen agreed. "But you answered everything else I asked without hesitating for a second, and that one you took a breath for." She tilted her head slightly. "So I'm just asking the question the breathing suggested." Annie looked out toward the corral, where Ira was working the mare through a slow circle patient and deliberate the same way he did everything. She thought about the ridge the first day, and the fence line, and the Sunday conversations that had accumulated into something she hadn't named yet, because naming it had felt premature. She thought about finding his name on that manifest, and how her chest had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with professional concern. "A while," she said. "I've known a while." Helen nodded, satisfied. "He's a slow starter," she said. "Always has been. But when he decides something is real, there's nothing more solid in the world." She looked at Annie steadily. "Don't let him wait too long. Not because he'll lose interest, he won't. But because he's been alone on this ranch for 7 years, and some of that solitude has settled into him in ways he doesn't fully see." A pause. "He needs someone who won't just visit it, who'll live in it with him." Annie held that quietly for a moment. "I know," she said. "Good." Helen picked up her coffee. "That's all I needed to know." The following Sunday, after Helen had gone back to Colorado, and the ranch had returned to its 2-person rhythm, Annie and Ira were working the south end of the field when he said without looking up from the soil, "She told me what the 2 of you talked about." Annie kept her hands in the work. "Did she? She has a habit of that, telling me what she thinks I need to know whether I asked or not." He turned the soil steadily. "She said you were exactly right for this place, and that I was being characteristically slow about seeing what was directly in front of me." "She said something similar to me," Annie said. He looked up then. "What did you say?" She met his gaze directly. "I said I'd known a while." Ira was quiet for a moment. He set the cultivator against his hip and looked at her with that full, unguarded attention that she'd seen only a few times, the look he had when he'd decided to stop being careful about what showed on his face. "Annie," he said, "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean, and I'm not a man who says the important things quickly. But I've been thinking about this since March, and Helen is right that I've been slow, and I'd rather be honest with you about what I'm thinking than have you waiting on a silence that isn't actually silence." She was still. Her hands rested in the soil of the flower field, and she was completely still. "I want you here," he said. "Not on Sundays, not on the North Road. Here on this ranch in this life. I'm not asking you to give up your work or change who you are. I'm asking whether this is something you want." He held her gaze. All of it. The hard winters and the dry years and the ordinary days and whatever comes after them. The field was warm around them. The flowers moved slightly in the afternoon air. Annie looked at the man across the row from her, the steady, unhurried, genuinely good man who had planted his mother's flowers and kept planting them for 20 years because some things were worth continuing, whether or not they made practical sense, and she felt something in her chest settle completely, like a weight that had been suspended for a long time, finally finding the floor. "Yes," she said. It came out simply because the simplest answer was the truest one. "That's what I want." He exhaled one long, quiet breath that told her he'd been carrying more tension about this moment than he'd let show. He almost smiled, and then he fully smiled, and it was the real smile, the one that made him younger, and she thought she could look at that smile for a very long time without tiring of it. "Good," he said. "Good," she said back. They went back to the field work. The conversation moved on to other things. But something had been placed between them that hadn't been there before. Not new exactly, because it had been building since March, but named now, and naming it had made it solid in a way that felt permanent. 3 days later, the land attorney's case broke open in a way nobody had fully anticipated. A clerk in the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, a young man named Eustace Foley, who had apparently been carrying a set of troubled feelings about certain filing irregularities for 2 years, and had found his moment, came forward with documentation showing that the Albuquerque attorney, a man named Harlan Price, had attempted to file 3 of the fraudulent surveys through the Santa Fe office under altered submission dates. Foley had flagged them at the time and been quietly overruled by his supervisor. When Pratt's investigation became public enough that Foley could see which direction the current was running, he'd packaged everything he had and delivered it to the territorial marshal, directly bypassing the land office chain entirely. Annie heard about this from Pratt on a Wednesday, and her first response was to sit down at her desk and work out the implications with the same systematic attention she brought to a freight manifest. If Foley's documentation held, and she thought it would, because the kind of man who sat on that information for 2 years before coming forward was not the kind of man who fabricated it, then Price hadn't just been involved in the Cass scheme. He'd been running a sustained campaign against Valley property titles, using the Hicks freight operation as his document pipeline, and the scope of it was significantly larger than 3 ranches. She went to Ned. "How many of the specialty cargo shipments involved Valley ranchers?" she asked. Ned looked at the manifest index she'd prepared. His expression aged slightly as he counted. 9 separate ranchers, he said, including 4 who've had title questions come up in the last 3 years that they couldn't explain the origin of. "Those questions came from Price," Annie said, "through surveys that were manufactured and moved through your freight system without your knowledge." She watched him absorb this. "Ned, those ranchers need to know. And they need to know now before Price's attorney files any further motions." Ned was already reaching for his hat. "I'll ride to each of them personally. Take the manifest copies. Specific pages, I've marked them." She handed him the prepared folder. She'd marked them the night before when she'd seen where the investigation was heading, because she had a habit of being ready before the moment arrived. "Each rancher needs to see their own name and their own parcel numbers. Make it specific. People absorb specific things." Ned looked at the folder, then at her. "How did you have these ready?" "I had a feeling about where Tuesday's conversation with Pratt was going," she said simply. "I prepared for the feeling being correct." He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in the specific admiration of a man who has come to rely on a quality in someone, and is still occasionally astonished by how completely it's present. "What would I have done without you?" he said. It wasn't a question, really. It was a statement. "Considerably less well," she said. And she said it without apology, because it was true. He laughed a real laugh, sudden and genuine, and went out to his horse. The 9 ranchers came to Cimarron over the following 4 days, some together and some separately, and the Hrick's office became an informal center of information, as Annie walked each of them through what the manifests showed about their specific parcels. Some of them she knew. Some she was meeting for the first time. All of them came in with the tight expressions of people who had been afraid for a long time of a threat they couldn't quite identify, and most of them left with something that looked like relief. Not that the threat had been small, but that it was now visible and therefore fightable. The last one to come was a rancher named Douglas Fenn, who ran the property adjacent to Ira's on the western side. He was a lean, angular man in his 60s, with a deliberate manner and eyes that had seen enough of the territory's less reliable inhabitants to be permanently cautious. He sat across Annie's desk and read the manifest pages she'd prepared for him twice carefully before he looked up. "These surveys were never filed," he said. "Correct. But if they had been, your eastern boundary would have been subject to a challenge that, with Price's legal resources behind it, would have taken years and significant money to resolve." She held his gaze. "You might have won, but the cost of winning might have been more than the land was worth to fight for." Fenn was quiet for a moment. "That's the calculation," he said. That's exactly the calculation he was making. Run up the cost until they sell or surrender. Yes. He looked at the manifest pages again. Then he looked at Annie with a directness that reminded her briefly of Helen Sutton. "You've been here since April," he said. "That's right. And you found all of this." "The numbers found it. I read the numbers." He shook his head. "Don't do that," he said, not unkindly. "Don't diminish it. I've been in this valley for 30 years, and nobody found it." He folded the pages carefully and put them in his coat. "What do you need from me for the court case?" "A signed statement confirming the parcel numbers on your title and attesting that no legitimate survey request was filed by you or on your behalf." She slid a prepared form across the desk. "I've drafted it. Read it carefully before you sign." He read it. He signed it. He stood up and put his hat on, and then he paused at the door. "Sutton's a lucky man," he said, not elaborating, just stating it plain and direct the way men of that generation sometimes said the things they thought mattered. Annie looked at him steadily. "I think we're both fortunate," she said. Fenn nodded, once satisfied with that answer, and left. The territorial court hearing was set for October. Price's attorney filed 2 motions to delay, and both were denied, which Pratt relayed to Annie with a satisfaction he didn't try to conceal. Cass entered a partial admission in exchange for a reduced charge, naming Price as the originator of the survey scheme and confirming that he'd moved the documentation deliberately and knowingly for 4 years. Lander cut a similar arrangement 3 days later. Price, facing the combined weight of Foley's documentation, Cass's statement, Lander's corroboration, and 18 freight manifests, prepared and annotated by a bookkeeper who had been methodical enough to build a case that a territorial court could follow without difficulty, retained a different attorney, and stopped returning telegrams from anyone connected to the valley. The first hard frost of the year came in the second week of September, earlier than usual, and Annie rode to Ira's ranch the morning after it and found him at the flower field. Not working it, just standing at the edge of it, looking at what the frost had done. The blooms were finished. The field was still the colors muted, now the vivid summer growth drawn back into the earth to wait. He heard her coming and didn't turn around immediately. She dismounted and came to stand beside him. "How do they look to you?" he asked. She studied the field. The structure of it was still there, the deliberate planting lines, the careful spacing, the evidence of 20 years of attention, visible even in dormancy. "Like something resting," she said. "Not like something gone." He turned to look at her. "That's exactly right," he said. She looked back at him. "You were testing me. I was curious," he said. "There's a difference." And there was the real smile again, unhurried and warm, the one she'd decided months ago she could look at indefinitely. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you asked. in the field in August. I remember what I asked. I want to do this properly, she said. I don't want to leave Margaret's house in the middle of a court case and move on to a ranch and have the valley spend the next year talking about the bookkeeper who managed things to her advantage. He listened. I want to wait until after the October hearing, she said. Until Price is dealt with and the case is settled and there's nothing left for anyone to use as a way to read my choices wrong. She met his gaze. And then I want to do this properly, with a minister and a date and everything that implies. Ira looked at her for a long moment. That's a sensible position, he said. It's not just sensible, she said. It's what I want, not because of what anyone will say, because this... She gestured slightly at the ranch and the dormant field, and the space between them deserves to be done right. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it the way you take hold of something you intend to keep. His hand was warm and certain around hers. October then, he said. October, she agreed. They stood at the edge of the dormant field, while the morning light moved across the frost-stiffened valley, and neither of them spoke for a while, because there was nothing that needed saying. The hard work was mostly done. The court would handle what remained. The field would come back in spring, the way it always did, the way things come back when someone has cared for them properly and given them time. And Annie Hawthorne, who had ridden into Cimarron Valley in April with a saddlebag and a ledger book and the absolute determination not to be afraid of anything. She couldn't see yet, stood with her hand in Ira Sutton's, and felt for the first time in as long as she could remember that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, in a life that was exactly the right size and shape for the person she'd spent 29 years becoming. The frost would melt by afternoon. The valley would go on. The flowers were resting, not gone. And some things she had learned were worth everything it took to tend them. The October hearing lasted 2 days, and on the second afternoon, Harlan Price was convicted on 4 counts of fraudulent survey filing, 2 counts of witness tampering through his agent Roy Lander, and 1 count of conspiracy to defraud territorial landholders. The territorial judge, a precise and unhurried man named Calloway, who had been on the bench for 16 years and had seen most varieties of frontier dishonesty, sentenced Price to 7 years and delivered the verdict in a tone that suggested he considered 7 years lenient. Annie was not in the courtroom for the verdict. She was at her desk at Hrick's Freighting, reconciling the October freight manifests, because the work was still there, and she was still its custodian, and she had long ago decided that the most honest response to having done something right was to go on doing the next right thing without making a ceremony of it. Pratt came to the office an hour after the verdict and stood in the doorway and said, "It's done, Miss Hawthorne." She looked up. Price, 7 years. Cass got 18 months with the partial admission. Lander got 2. He paused. Foley's been given a commendation by the Territorial Land Office, which I think surprised him more than it surprised anyone else. It shouldn't have surprised him, Annie said. He did the right thing. He did it late. He did it when it counted. That's what matters. She set her pen down and looked at Pratt directly. Thank you, Howard, for taking it seriously from the beginning. I was not a man who deflected compliments awkwardly. He received them the way he received everything squarely. Thank you for building a case that held, he said. I've worked with better paid people who couldn't do what you did with those manifests. She nodded once, and he left, and she picked up her pen and went back to the October numbers. But her hands were still for a moment before she started writing again, because some things deserved one quiet moment of acknowledgement before the next thing began. She told Ned that afternoon that she'd be stepping back from full-time hours at the start of the new year. Not leaving, she was careful to be precise about this, but moving to a structured part-time arrangement that would keep the Hrick's accounts current while allowing her to manage the ranch books as well. She had already designed the system in her head. She laid it out for Ned in 10 minutes, including the transition plan for Billy, who had developed enough under her supervision to handle the daily reconciliations reliably if he had clear protocols to follow. Ned listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for the characteristic moment he always took before responding to something that mattered. Billy's ready, he said. He is. He just doesn't know it yet. When are you going to tell him? After Christmas. I want to give him a month of running the daily work with me watching before he runs it all alone. She folded her hands on the desk. You'll have better books next year than you've ever had, Ned. Billy's meticulous when he's given clear structure, and the structure will be there. I know. He looked at her steadily. You've changed this office, Annie. Not just the books, the way we operate. He said it without sentimentality, just as a plain accounting of fact. I want you to know I see that. I do know, she said. And I'm glad of it. She rode to Ira's ranch that evening, with the verdict delivered, and the transition planned, and a feeling in her chest that was quieter and deeper than happiness. More like the specific satisfaction of watching something you've worked hard for finally become what it was supposed to be. He was waiting at the gate. He'd heard from Douglas Fenn, who'd heard from someone who'd been at the courthouse, and his expression when she rode in told her he already knew the broad shape of the day. 7 years, she said. I heard. He took her horse's reins. You all right? I'm better than all right. She dismounted and looked at him. It's done, Ira. All of it. Price Cass Lander the surveys. Done. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Come inside, I made supper. It was the first time she'd eaten supper at his table. Not because the invitation hadn't been extended before, but because she'd maintained the careful propriety she'd promised herself. The deliberate patience of a woman who wanted the valley to see her choices clearly and without ambiguity. But the hearing was over. The case was closed. And the man she intended to marry was standing in front of her, with the particular quiet warmth in his expression that meant he'd made something for her, which was its own kind of declaration. All right, she said. The kitchen smelled of venison stew, and the wood smoke that lived permanently in the walls of an old ranch house, and there was bread on the table that he'd clearly baked himself, slightly uneven, but substantial, and she sat across from him and ate and talked and laughed more easily than she had in months. The weight of the last 6 months, the careful vigilance, the controlled presentation, the constant awareness of being watched and assessed had lifted, and what was underneath it was simply herself. In a kitchen she intended to know well, with a man she had chosen as deliberately as she had ever chosen anything. Helen wrote again, he said midway through the meal. What did she say? She asked me to pass along that she expects an invitation in writing at a proper address with enough notice to arrange travel. He looked at Annie over the bread. She also said, and I'm quoting here, that if I waited past December, she was going to come down personally and say the words for me. Annie laughed. I like your sister very much. She likes you considerably. He paused. She said you were the most sensible woman she'd ever met, and that I didn't deserve you, but that since you appeared to want me anyway, I should move quickly before you came to your senses. She's not wrong on any count, Annie said. Ira smiled, the real one, full and warm. No, he said. She's not. They were married on the 14th of November, 1878, in the Cimarron Valley Church, on a clear, cold morning with the mountains sharp against a sky so blue it looked painted. Margaret wept with a thoroughness that made her husband hand her his second handkerchief before the ceremony was halfway through. Billy stood in the back and tried to look dignified, and mostly succeeded. Ned Hicks sat in the third row and kept his expression composed, except for the moment the minister pronounced them married, when something moved through his face that was quietly and completely glad. Douglas Fenn came, which surprised Annie, and brought his wife, which surprised her more. Fenn shook Ira's hand and looked at Annie and said, Well done, both of you, with the economical sincerity of a man who meant exactly what he said and nothing more. Helen had come down from Colorado as promised with Frank and 2 of her 3 children, and she embraced Annie before the ceremony with the particular warmth of a woman who had already decided on her feelings and saw no reason to be restrained about expressing them. I told him October, Annie said into Helen's shoulder. You held him to November, Helen said. That's close enough. She pulled back and looked at Annie's face. Are you happy? Annie thought about the question for one honest second. Yes, she said. Completely. Helen squeezed her hands and went to find her seat, and Annie stood in the small vestibule of the church and felt the particular irreplaceable quality of a moment. You know, you will remember exactly, not the details of it necessarily, but the feeling of it, the specific temperature and weight and clarity of standing on the correct side of a decision you've made with your whole self. Then she walked down the aisle and married Ira Sutton, and the valley witnessed it, and that was that. The first winter of their marriage was hard, in the way that Cimarron winters were deep cold stock to manage the constant attentive labor of keeping a ranch functioning when the ground was iron and the water troughs iced over before dawn. Annie learned the winter rhythms of the ranch the same way she'd learned everything else in her life, by paying attention, asking questions when she didn't know, and trusting her own competence when she did. Ira was a patient teacher and a better partner than she'd expected, and she'd expected a great deal. They worked the mornings together and separately in the afternoons, she at the ranch desk with the account books, he in the barn or the pasture with the stock, and came together in the evenings in the kitchen with the wood stove going and the cold pressed against the windows and the particular warmth of two people who have chosen each other on purpose, filling the space between them. She learned that he had a habit of reading at night in the chair by the fire until he fell asleep over the book, and that he woke at 4:30 without fail and without complaint, and that he made coffee the way he made everything, with complete attention and without shortcuts. She learned that he was more openly affectionate in private than his contained public manner suggested, and that he laughed easily and genuinely at things that struck him as funny, and that he was the kind of husband who noticed when something was wearing on her before she'd said a word about it, and who asked directly rather than managing around the edges. "You're quiet today," he said one January evening, looking up from his book. "I'm thinking." "About?" She set down her pen. "Billy made an error in the December manifest reconciliation. Small one. But it tells me the daily protocol I wrote for him needs a second checkpoint step that I didn't include." She looked at the desk. "I should have anticipated it." "You built the best system you could with what you knew at the time," he said. "Now you know something more. You'll fix it." "I know. I'm not troubled by the error." She turned her pen over in her hand. "I'm troubled that I didn't see it coming. Annie." He said her name with the particular weight that meant he was going to say something she needed to hear, and wasn't going to soften it. "You can't see everything coming. Nobody can. The measure isn't whether you prevent every error. It's whether you built something sound enough to catch them when they happen." She looked at him. He was watching her with steady eyes over the top of his book, the firelight making him look like something carved and warm at once. "You're right," she said. "I'm occasionally right," he said. "You should note it down for the records." She threw a piece of bread at him. He caught it without looking up from his book, which made her laugh, and the tension she'd been carrying all day broke cleanly apart and was gone. Spring came with the particular violence that high desert springs have, not gradual, but sudden, as if the cold had simply decided it was finished and stepped aside. The flower field came back with it, pushing through the thawed earth in the first week of April, with the specific determination of things that have been waiting and know exactly what they're returning to. Annie was there when the first stems broke through. She hadn't planned to be. She'd been walking the fence line on the eastern boundary with the account ledger under her arm, checking the markers against the land title documents that were now formally and permanently in clean order, and she'd come to the south edge of the field and looked down and seen the green. She stood there for a moment without moving. She heard Ira come up behind her because she'd learned the sound of his walk and could place him without turning. He stopped beside her and looked at the field. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she said back. They stood at the field's edge and watched the spring move through it, the color coming up slowly. The yellow first, then the white, then the deep orange, and the vivid blue that still surprised her every year, despite knowing it was coming. The field was not just his mother's anymore, and it was not just his. It was theirs in the way that things become shared when two people tend them together long enough that the tending itself becomes a language. James was born in August of 1879, on a Tuesday that started as a perfectly ordinary day and became the day that changed the dimension of everything. He arrived with a quantity of opinion about the experience that he expressed immediately and at length, and Ira, who had maintained a composure throughout the preceding hours that Annie had found both admirable and slightly implausible, looked at his son for the first time and said absolutely nothing for 30 seconds. Just looked with an expression she had never seen on his face before and that she understood immediately was new in him. Something the moment had made that hadn't existed before. "He's very loud," Ira said finally. "He's your son," Annie said. "He has opinions." Helen, who had come down from Colorado with her own infant on her hip and the unapologetic intention of being useful, laughed from the doorway with a completeness that filled the room. Clara followed 2 years later, smaller than James, quieter, with her father's gray-green eyes, and her mother's habit of looking at things with a deliberate attention that seemed to assess and file information simultaneously. By the time Clara was 4, she was following Annie through the account books with a focused curiosity that made Billy, on one of his occasional visits, say to Ira in a low voice, "She's going to know how to keep books before she's 10. Before she's 8, Ira said without any particular surprise. James, by contrast, had attached himself to the flower field with an intensity that had bypassed interest and arrived directly at devotion. He knew every variety by name by the time he was 5, in the systematic way that children who love a thing absorb everything about it without effort. He would walk the rows with Ira on Sunday mornings, asking questions in the rapid, relentless way of small children who have not yet learned to ration their curiosity. And Ira answered every one with the same patient, specific attention he gave everything that mattered to him. Annie watched them from the fence, one April Sunday, her account ledger balanced on the rail beside her, and felt something that was larger and quieter than happiness. The kind of feeling that doesn't have an exact word because it encompasses too many things at once. The field was in its early spring fullness. James was crouched at the near row with his hands in the soil, and Ira was crouched beside him, saying something she couldn't hear from this distance, and the valley stretched out around them in the clear morning light in every direction, indifferent and beautiful, and entirely theirs to live in. It was the summer of 1883, when Douglas Fenn's eldest son came to the Hicks office with a question about his father's account, and Billy, now 22, and confident in a way he hadn't been. At 17, handled the entire inquiry correctly, and without needing Annie once. She was at the ranch desk when Billy told her about it afterward, stopping by on his way home in the early evening, proud of himself in the undefended way young men are when they've done something well in front of someone whose opinion matters to them. "You didn't need me," she said. "No, ma'am." He said it with the pleasure of a man who has earned his own ground. "Good," she said. "That's exactly right." He rode off toward town, and she sat at the ranch desk with the account books around her and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening. Ira in the barn with the horses. James calling something from the yard that she recognized as a question about supper. Clara in the kitchen corner with the small ledger Annie had made her, practicing the column entries in her careful child's hand. She opened the ranch account book and looked at the numbers. They were good numbers. Solid, accurate, the product of 5 years of careful management. Freight income, steady ranch income. Growing the horse operation that Ira had quietly built around the gray mare, now producing animals that buyers came from 3 counties to look at. The land was free of encumbrance. The title was clean. The flower field was in its 5th year of her tending alongside his, and the east boundary markers stood exactly where they were supposed to stand. Ira came in from the barn, and she heard him stop to say something to James in the yard, and James laughed at whatever it was. And then the door opened, and Ira came through with the particular ease of a man moving through a space that belongs completely to him, and to which he belongs completely in return. He looked at her at the desk with the lamp lit and the account books open, and Clara's small voice counting numbers quietly in the corner, and he had the expression she'd come to think of as the one that meant everything was exactly as it should be. "Numbers good?" he asked. "Numbers are good," she said. He came and stood behind her and looked over her shoulder at the columns, and his hand rested briefly on her shoulder, in the unhurried, certain way of a man who has been touching the same person for 5 years and has not once taken that permission for granted. "James wants to plant a new row on the north slope next spring," he said. "He's been campaigning for it since February. He mentioned it to me in March," Annie said, "and again in April." She glanced up at him. "He has your patience for planning and my persistence in pressing a case." "God help us," Ira said, and she laughed, and Clara looked up from her ledger and said, "What's funny?" with the particular directness of a child who intends to be included in everything, and Ira said, "Your brother," and Clara said, "Obviously," and went back to her numbers. Outside, the valley held the last of the summer light, that specific gold that Ira had once told her he'd never found anywhere else, and that she now understood completely because she'd looked for it herself in the years since he'd named it and had not found it anywhere but here. The flower field ran along the eastern slope in the evening warmth, dense and permanent, tended by 3 generations of a family's care. Now his mother's hands, first, then his, then both of theirs together, and now James's small, serious hands beside them, learning how. Annie Hawthorne had ridden into Cimarron Valley on an April morning in 1878, with a saddlebag, a ledger book, and the absolute determination not to be afraid of anything she couldn't see yet. She had found a field that had no practical reason to exist, and a man who had planted it anyway, because some things are worth continuing, whether or not they make practical sense. She had done her work and held her ground, and chosen clearly, and the life she had built from those choices was sitting around her in this room, and running in the yard outside it, and sleeping in the east bedroom, and growing in the field on the slope, solid and real, and entirely permanently hers. Some people ride through a valley and keep riding. Some people crest a ridge, see something that stops them, and have the courage to turn their horse toward it and find out what it means. Annie had turned her horse, and everything that mattered had grown from that single unplanned moment of choosing to look more closely at a thing that shouldn't have been there, a field of impossible flowers in a dry and practical world, and deciding without quite knowing why that it was worth a second look. It was worth every look she had ever given it. It was worth everything.